Ambassador D.P. Srivastava, who is Distinguished Fellow of Vivekananda International Foundation and has written an excellent book on titled Forgotten Kashmir, The Other Side of the Line of Control, published by HarperCollins in this year. So he is he was Indian ambassador to Iran for 2011 to 15, and earlier he led negotiations on Indian participations in Chabahar port. He also served as Indian ambassador to Czech Republic, Libya, and India's High Commission to Malta. He joined Indian Force Service in 1978, and later, after retirement, he served as senior advisor to ONGC Videsh Limited. He also served as an independent director on the board of GAIL, Gas Authority of India. He is currently on the board of directors of India Ports Global, charged with the development of Chabahar Port. So his book is comprehensive. I have seen it and gone through it. Spanning over, it has 23 chapters, and it provides a detailed and important insights into the internal dynamics and pact policies and practices in this region, which has eluded, generally eluded both Indian and international attention for about 6-7 decades. POK, by POK, I mean in Pak occupied Kashmir, that is what they call as Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and Gilgit Baltistan region, what was earlier called northern areas. This entire territory across the LOC was kept under iron and has been kept under iron curtain by successive Pakistani governments, whether civilian or military. And Pakistan assumed direct control of Gilgit Baltistan in 1947-48. It designated the area as northern areas, and it called the Pak occupied territory of Mirpur Pravaz region as Azad Jammu and Kashmir. But in actual practice, the area is not Azad, that is free. There is clear-cut discrepancy in Pakistan's policy and its political and constitutional relationship with both POK and Gilgit-Baltistan. Pakistan has been claiming that Jammu and Kashmir has been disputed territory. Its stand in the United Nations on Kashmir is based on the premise of plebiscite or right to self-determination or implementation of UN resolutions. But in real practice, it has never encouraged plebiscite or self-determination in its own occupied territories. It not only annexed Gilgit-Baltistan, huge territory of over 70,000 square kilometers of Gilgit-Baltistan, which is a very strategic territory, right away in 1947-48 and termed it as northern areas, but enforced direct federal administration in this region. Now they say that maybe under China's pressure, they are going to remove this anomaly also or ambiguity in the constitutional relationship between GB and Pakistan and formally integrate it as the fifth province of Pakistan. It remains to be seen how and in what manner it will impact upon Pakistan's stand over the disputed character of Jammu and Kashmir and in the international fora. Both POK and Gilgit-Baltistan constitute one-third of the total area of undivided Jammu and Kashmir, around 100,000 square kilometers. POK has 10 administrative districts. Gilgit-Baltistan, with an area of around 73,000 square kilometers, also has 10 administrative districts. Where the Srivastava has divided his book into 7 sections and in total having 23 chapters. As the author states, it looks at, I quote him, it looks at POK in terms of the aspirations of its people and the policies of Pakistan. So I hand over to Mr. Srivastava and let us hear from him.
Thank you, Professor Varico, for a very generous introduction. My book, Forgotten Kashmir, The Other Side of the Line of Control, is based almost entirely on Pakistani UN and international sources, and it uses Pakistan's stated positions as the benchmark rather than using Indian yardstick to judge Pakistani policies and actions in that part of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which Pakistan illegally occupied in 47. The Pakistani narrative, there are two prominent strands, Azadi and wishes of the people. We will see how far these relate to not only the issue of accession, but should also be reflected in the governance, whether the people are azad or free to choose the system of governance they have, and how far that structure reflects their wishes. First slide. Pakistan, when the Jammu and Kashmir issue went to the United Nations, this was in January 1948, and it was taken there not by Pakistan but by India in response to the invasion which Pakistan had sponsored using the tribals. Pakistan government in its official submission, which you will see here, denied any responsibility for giving aid and assistance to so-called invaders. It's interesting that the invasion was led by a serving officer of Pakistan Army, the then Colonel Akbar Khan, who later became Major General, and he was Chief of General Staff when he was actually arrested a few years later in so-called Rawalpindi conspiracy case. Now, Akbar Khan, in his memoirs, Raiders in Kashmir, has described that the whole process of decision making for this invasion. He said that he had proposed an internal uprising in Jammu and Kashmir. This was turned down by Pakistani cabinet headed by Liaquat Ali Khan, which decided on a tribal invasion. This tribal invasion was led by Akbar Khan under the pseudonym of General Tariq. My book also uses extensively Pakistani sources, and one of the key sources is Yusuf Sarraf. And Yusuf Sarraf was a Muslim conference activist. He retired as Chief Justice of POK Supreme Judicial Council. He was a close associate of Ghulam Abbas, the head of the Muslim conference. Yusuf Sarraf has described his conversation with Sardar Ibrahim, the first president of POK. Sardar Ibrahim said that he declared the POK government on the basis of two phone calls received from Rawalpindi. One call came from Khwaja Rahim, the commissioner of Rawalpindi, and the other call came from Begum Naseem, the then wife of Colonel Akbar Khan, who was leading the so-called tribal invasion. Now it's interesting, the calls came from Rawalpindi, not Karachi. Karachi was the capital. Why Rawalpindi? Because Rawalpindi then as now was the Pakistani army headquarters. So Pakistan's Kashmir policy has been shaped by Pakistan army right from the beginning. Akbar Khan has written in his memoirs that there were at least 4 meetings chaired by Liaquat Ali Khan, the Prime Minister, and they were spread over 4 months period. Akbar Khan was later inducted into Prime Minister's Secretariat also. So there was complicity right at the top. Yusuf Sarraf who himself was a Kashmiri and has led a very major role in formation of POK. He was of course pro-Pakistani. He has said that even though most of the Muslim conference leaders had crossed over to Pakistan by the time tribal invasion was launched, they had no role in the decision making. So from the beginning, the so-called, the Kashmir struggle was sponsored and controlled by Pakistan Army. Now, next slide. Pakistan, though it recognized the, though it created the Azad government, so-called Azad Kashmir government, it hesitated to actually recognize it. And this is a quote directly from the report of the UN Commission on India and Pakistan, where the report says the foreign ministry appreciated that even his, the first part, the report says UN never recognized the so-called Azad Kashmir government because the government was a result of an illegality, that is Pakistan's illegal occupation of the territory, first invasion and then continued occupation despite the UN resolutions asking it to withdraw. So UN never recognized it. And as this report says, even his own government, that is the Sir Zarfullah Khan, had not granted legal recognition to the Azad movement in view of the implications that might arise. Now, what are those implications which Sir Zarfullah Khan, the foreign minister of Pakistan, was worried about? If it was really Azad and Pakistan was committed to respecting that Azadi, there should have been no hesitation. But Pakistan wanted to absorb this territory in Pakistan instead of letting Kashmir be Azad Kashmir. So right from the beginning, there was this hesitation, and Sardar Ibrahim, the first president of POK, has written in his memoirs that this delay on part of Pakistan government to recognize POK cost them dear. Now, next slide, please. It's interesting, why it was Pakistan insisted on calling it Azad. It was for a simple reason. Pakistan had committed aggression. The UN, when the matter went to the UN passed a resolution which had 3 parts. The first part said, called for ceasefire. The second part asked for withdrawal of Pakistani troops. And the third part said there should be a plebiscite. Now, Pakistan did not want to withdraw from the territory illegally occupied by it. And that, that thread runs through, the series of postures or stand taken by Pakistan government. So one of the first things they did was to create the fiction of Azad government, because they claimed that these troops, which were actually Pakistani troops, were Azad forces and they were not under Pakistani control and Pakistan could not withdraw them. The resolution had said Pakistan should withdraw all troops under its control. So to escape that obligation, Pakistan created this fiction that these were Azad forces under Azad government, which simply didn't exist. Incidentally, Ayub Khan, in his memoirs, Friends Not Masters, has mentioned that when he came back, his first posting after partition, he was sent to East Pakistan. He returned from East Pakistan around 49, and he was being groomed to take over as the next Pakistani army chief. Till then, Pakistan army, right, like the Indian army, was under British officers. And one of the first actions taken by Ayub Khan was to bring Azad force to apply the Pakistani Army Act to Azad forces. So from the now this is a man who became president of Pakistan, and he's writing of 49. Even before 49, so what Ayub Khan said, that Azad forces were actually under Pakistani army's control, and even before this, UN reports mention that during the visit of Corbell, the UN mediator to India and Pakistan, he was given a presentation in Pakistan Army headquarters, where the Pakistan Army leadership said that the Azad forces are under the tactical and operational control of Pakistan Army. So the whole thing was a fiction. Now, once the Kashmir issue went to the UN, and the UN UNCIP resolution was adopted in August 48. That resolution had 3 parts, which I just described. Now, the issue of plebiscite, which has haunted Kashmir's story from the beginning. This plebiscite was supported very strongly by UK. What you see here in the slide is the UK statement on Cyprus issue some years later. And you read it, the question of circumstances in which principle of self-determination could be applied in any territories of a member state was clearly an internal matter for that state itself. Any infringement by UN of that fundamental principles would be regarded by UK government as ultra-vires and completely unacceptable. Now, this is 1957 statement in UN Security Council. Even before that, in 48, UK was maintaining in the United Nations on Cyprus question that Cyprus, which was a distant colony, was actually part of domestic jurisdiction of United Kingdom, and therefore UN was barred. Now, this is complete reverse of what the UK was suggesting for India, for the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now we come to a very, I was mentioning the plebiscite issue. There is this impression or historiography which has actually gained some ground even in circles in India, that India went back on it. It was actually Pakistan went back on it. There were only 3 specific occasions when plebiscite was offered. The first, and on all the 3 occasions, India was willing to consider it. It was Pakistan which rejected it. The first occasion was 2nd November 1947. This was Mountbatten's visit to Lahore for a meeting with Jinnah. And this is recorded by Ellen Campbell Johnson, who was Mountbatten's aide, in his memoirs, Mission with Mountbatten. Campbell says that Mountbatten offered plebiscite under UN's auspices to Jinnah. Jinnah refused. Jinnah instead offered to do this bilaterally instead of under the UN's auspices. Mountbatten had to regret it because he said, and Jinnah said that let's organize it. That is the 2 governor generals. Mountbatten said that he was a constitutional head and it was beyond his remit. Why did Jinnah, fudge this issue? Because the tribal invasion was going on and the tribals had plundered, killed and raped Hindus and Muslims alike without discrimination. So Jinnah knew that a vote would not have gone in Pakistan's favor and therefore he killed the issue. The second occasion arose, this was 1950. UN mediator Owen Dixon came to India. Owen Dixon suggested regional plebiscite because he said that a single plebiscite across the entire state would leave pockets of minorities on either side of the political divide and lead to forced migration, which was actually happening on a much larger scale in the subcontinent. To avoid this, he suggested regional plebiscite and he limited its scope to the valley because he said that in places like Jammu and Kashmir or in Jammu or Ladakh, it was clear by the composition of the population that they would like to go to India. It was valley which was the issue where there was a contention because the majority of the population were Muslim, 70% population. The main political force, however, was the National Conference, which had thrown its lot with India. Now, Pakistan should have jumped at it because if one accepts their theory that the Muslims wanted to join Pakistan, then the Muslim domination or the salience was highest in the valley. Pakistan turned it down. Owen Dixon, in his report to the UN, has mentioned that Pakistan's reason was that this was a departure from the issue, from the principle of single plebiscite. In the same paragraph, Owen Dixon has reported to the UN, but I was given the impression that Pakistan was willing to accept partition of the state provided it got the valley. So Pakistan was willing to make a departure from the principle of single plebiscite provided it got the valley, and it got the valley without a vote, which it could not risk. Now we come to the third occasion when plebiscite was offered, and this is the most critical occasion. This was 1953 August, when Sheikh Abdullah was dismissed and arrested. Now, there are authors like A.G. Noorani, who claimed that India lost the Abdullah card and therefore Nehru went back on the offer of plebiscite. It's absolutely incorrect. After Abdullah's arrest, Pakistan proposed bilateral talks. India was slightly hesitant, but accepted the offer. Muhammad Ali Bogra, Pakistan's prime minister, came to Delhi. The two prime ministers signed New Delhi communique between Pandit Nehru and Muhammad Ali Bogra. Both agreed to plebiscite. Bogra went back. 3 months later, on 1st December 1953, he wrote a letter to Pandit Nehru going back on the offer of plebiscite, which he had committed in a public document in Delhi during his August visit. And it was the same reason that, departure from the principle of single plebiscite. And as I have explained earlier, this was simply an excuse because they were willing to accept a partition, but they were, which was also a departure from the principle of, which was a complete departure from the principle of plebiscite. Now, why these repeated refusal by Pakistan to accept plebiscite? There is something more to it, and that comes out in the works of Yusuf Sarraf, who was no friend of India, and he has played a very major role in POK's creation. Muslim Conference Working Committee, after partition, in a meeting in September 47, had opted for an independent Kashmir under the Maharaja. It was Yusuf Sarraf who got this decision overturned next day in the general conference of the party in favor of Pakistan. So he, you can't doubt his pro-Pakistani credentials. Now, Yusuf Sarraf has written a 2-volume memoir, and he has mentioned what is called Sudhan Revolt. And this was a major reason why Pakistan was hesitant to accept any offer of plebiscite. Sudhan Revolt started with the dismissal of Sardar Ibrahim Khan by Pakistan government in April 1950. This was a month before Owen Dixon came. Sardar Ibrahim belonged to Sudhan clan or tribe. This was a martial tribe. And Ibrahim, in his own memoirs, has traced their origin to Northwest Frontier Province, that they were basically Pathans. Now, Sudhan revolts very soon spread all over POK, and Pakistan government had to deploy the army. This army operation lasted well into the 50s. Next slide, please. Now, this, Yusuf Sarraf writes that sometime after Ayub Khan assumed power, which was only after October 58, he came to POK and he was very angry with the people there for raising this banner of revolt against Pakistan, and he had stopped their pensions. Most of the people were ex-servicemen, and his old orderly who had brought him up came to him and he said कि what was the, आपको दूध पिलाने का क्या फायदा हुआ जब आपने हमारी pension रोक दी? He had brought up this man, and he said this Ayub Khan when he was a boy, and he said that he why did he stop his pension? So Ayub Khan restored the pension. Now, why I'm giving this anecdote? Because this places the date, that is when the Sudhan revolt was still continuing in 58. Now, in 1955, Muslim Conference, which was a party which opted for Pakistan, it gave a memorandum to Pakistan Constituent Assembly, and there are some verbatim quotes. And the memorandum said, for the last few years, the people of Azad Kashmir in general and those of Punj in particular have been subjected to great torture and terrorization. Account of this terrorism is very heartrending. They also said that the memorandum mentioned ruthless and random firing by mortar guns took place, so that they were using actually heavy caliber weapons against the civilian population. They described mass arrest, detention, rape of women, unnatural behavior with young boys. Women were arrested and reading from the book and subjected to unbecoming and insulting treatment. For 6 years, there was no elected government, and the memorandum ends by saying, terrorized by this situation, 3,000 people have gone over to the Indian side of the ceasefire line. Now, this memorandum was introduced by Krishna Menon in the debate in the Security Council in 1957. Pakistan's foreign minister, a very voluble man called Sir Zafrullah Khan, he was present and he did not dimmer. So obviously, there was truth in it. Now, this memorandum, which was circulated as a UN document, disappeared from public view. It was classified. I have got it declassified, and I must give my thanks to my friend and batchmate Ramu Damodran, who got this declassified. And UN has now put it up on their website, so you can access this. Now, this actually was the reason, Sudhan revolt, why Pakistan rejected plebiscite. Now, next slide. Now, Pakistan, while the Indian state of J&K has had, right from the beginning, there was a democratic setup, there were elections and so on. POK was run on the basis of executive fiats. These are called rules of business issued by Rawalpindi, where the Ministry of Kashmir Affairs was located. Essentially, it was ruled by a joint secretary level officer of POK government, of Ministry of Kashmir Affairs. And there's an anecdote which was, one of the POK presidents, he has narrated this personal experience or humiliating experience. He went to meet this joint secretary, and the joint secretary said there was a call coming from Karachi, which was then capital of Pakistan. So joint secretary asked the POK president कि आप जरा बगल के कमरे में PA के कमरे में बैठ जाइए. Please go and sit in my PA's room while I take this call from Karachi. So this was the actual state of affairs, that is, of this statutory government. Now, there were no elections held on the basis of general franchise or universal franchise till 1970. But before that, during Ayub era, Ayub introduced a system of what is called basic democrats in Pakistan, which was a very limited franchise. And this was also introduced in POK. In fact, it was first introduced in POK. Now, these elections which took place sometime around 63 or something, or 64, the Muslim Conference President, Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas, was not allowed to participate in the elections. Now, this really shows what the way the POK was being run. There was no azadi when the head of the main political party was not allowed to participate in whatever sham elections they were holding. Now we come to 70s, and in 70s there were 3 events, major events in quick succession. There was the 71 war, in which Pakistan lost its eastern wing, and that was apart from the territorial loss, that also called into question the whole idea of the two-nation theory, because it was predominantly Muslim, and not only predominantly Muslim, but the larger part of the Muslim population of Pakistan, which had decided to break away from that country. So it was a watershed. Now, the second event was adoption of Pakistan's constitution in 1973 under Bhutto government, and the third was adoption of POK constitution in 1974. It was called interim constitution. Why interim? Because Pakistan's stated position is that the final disposition of Jammu and Kashmir will take place in accordance in a plebiscite in accordance with UN resolutions. So they have built this whole cosmetic structure that this is an interim constitution. Now, interestingly, the interim constitution of POK which remains interim despite, passage of 5 decades. It says right in the preamble, and I'll read from my book. This is page 143. And whereas in the discharge of its responsibilities under the UNSIP resolutions, the government of Pakistan has approved of the proposed repeal and reenactment of the said Azad Jammu and Kashmir Government Act 1970 and authorized the President of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir to introduce the present bill in the Legislative Assembly of Azad Jammu and Kashmir for consideration and passage. So the constitution did not originate from the people of POK. It originated from Pakistan government, which had introduced even its introduction in the so-called POK assembly. Now, constitutions everywhere, they essentially define the relationship between the state and the citizen, and they define the powers of the elected assembly, parliament, the government, and the judiciary. Now, in case of POK constitution or the interim constitution, it's interesting. There are 3 key articles: Article 31, 33, and 56. Article 31 is the most important. This lays down, it lays down the distribution of powers, and in the list given, only mention the powers given to council headed by Pakistan's Prime Minister. So POK constitution does not define powers of the elected assembly and the elected government, which are titular. It defines only powers of Pakistan within POK. And those powers are not limited to those 3 areas of, foreign policy, defense, and currency. There are as many as 54 areas within POK on which this council headed by Pakistan's Prime Minister could exercise both legislative and executive authority. In any democracy, there is separation of legislature with executive, and here both were combined, and they're combined in the council. This was basically ruled by proxy by the council headed by Pakistan's Prime Minister. This was much criticized. This was removed in 2018. This is almost 50 years later, under 13th Amendment of POK Constitution, and the council has been relegated now to advisory role. But those powers of the council have not been transferred to the elected assembly. Now they are directly assumed by Pakistan. So Pakistan sits inside the compact of powers of POK and exercises direct legislative and executive authorities on as many as 32 subjects within POK. And this includes all the key areas from taxation to roads and highways and water and electricity. The chief resources of POK are, number 1, water, which is hydropower, and this is Mangla Dam. And now, northern areas, which is part of POK, again is going to have a series of dams called Indus Cascade. So water and electricity are not part of the elected assembly's powers. They are directly assumed by Pakistan. And the other key resource is the strategic location, that is the strategic roads running from Pakistan to Kashmir, which is the mainstay of CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Both are directly controlled by Pakistan under 13th Amendment of POK, which came into being in 2018. This was a year before repeal of Article 370 by India, which was much criticized by Pakistan. But let me go back to the POK constitution. There are a few other very interesting areas. I mentioned there were 3 key provisions. One was Article 31. The other was Article 33. This is the amendment procedure, and the Article 33 made clear that no amendment in the 3 articles, 31, 33, and 56, could be carried out without the approval of Pakistan. So Pakistan had not only created a monopoly of power for itself within POK constitution, but also guaranteed its in perpetuity by imposing this condition that these 3 key provisions cannot be amended without its approval. The third of this triad is Article 56. Next slide. Can you just, I think, okay, I'll just read out the, can you, next slide, please? Yes, no, X ke baad hai. Yes, Article 56. This article said, act not to derogate from the responsibilities of Pakistan. Nothing in this act shall derogate from the responsibilities of government of Pakistan in relations to matters specified in so and so article section 31. Now, basically, this overrules the entire POK constitution, and this was actually used by twice by Pakistan government to dismiss the elected legislature and the government. Nawaz Sharif invoked Article 56 to dismiss POK government in 91, and before that, Nawaz Sharif was a civilian head. General Zia had done that in 1977. So the demise of POK's elected assembly and government is built into POK constitution itself. This is a very ingenious arrangement where Pakistan escapes the stigma of directly manipulating and controlling every aspect of POK's life by building in that control mechanism within the POK constitution. Now, if we can just go back slide. There is another very interesting, no, go back. I think we are missing something. Okay, there is a slide on state subject. This is the eighth slide. Iske baad hai. Yes. One of the issues which often comes up, this is the issue of property rights and the special character of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, on the other side, there was no Article 370 at any stage. There is a passing reference to state subject in POK's interim constitution. But you read the wording, it's state subject means a person for the time being, emphasis is mine, residing in the Azad Jammu and Kashmir or Pakistan. So, there is no compartmentalization. It can be movement either way. Who is a state subject as defined in the late government of state of Jammu and Kashmir notification, so and so, as amended from time to time. Now, what this is referring to, this was a notification of Maharaja's time of 1927, which had tried to sort of, preserve the demographic composition of the state. Now, this was amended, if my memory serves me right, once. Now, this particular provision says as amended from time to time. So, no, it's not clear how many times it has been amended in Pakistani version. Now, the other aspect, this is the property rights, and the two are linked. Bhutto abolished the state subject rule for Gilgit-Baltistan, or for northern areas, or Gilgit-Baltistan, which comprises of 85% of the area called POK, and he did this as far back as 1974. And in case of POK, which is just a rump, 15% of the territory, this is retained in a very diluted form. Now, there are other aspects which I have brought out in my book. Under POK constitution, the distribution of powers between the council and the elected assembly, the issues of citizenship and migration are listed as part of the council's powers. So it was Pakistan government, not the state government, which could enforce or monitor even this diluted form of state subject rule. But the most significant thing, the POK constitution was adopted sometime in 1974. 2 years before that, in 1972, Pakistan's Citizenship Act was extended to POK as well as northern areas, as Gilgit-Baltistan was then called. So people of POK and Gilgit-Baltistan became Pakistan citizens, not as a result of their own exercise of their, not as a result of wishes of the people being exercised or expressed, but as a result of Pakistani Act passed by Pakistani Parliament. Now, if that is the case, then where is the issue of plebiscite? Let's move on to, I had mentioned Article 13th Amendment. This is almost in 2018, which has relegated council, but now Pakistan has assumed those powers directly. There is a parallel development on case of Gilgit-Baltistan. Now, let me go back to 1947. Gilgit-Baltistan or northern areas is the 85% of the state of the territory under Pakistani control. This was the Gilgit Scouts. They, under Major Brown, they raised the banner of revolt. Now, this was very interesting that the freedom struggle was being led not by the local people but by the representative of the colonial powers. And after this revolt, which took place on 1st November, this area, by that time, the Jammu and this Azad Kashmir government had been formed. It had been formed according to Pakistani narrative on 24th October, a week earlier. When northern area seceded from the state of Jammu and Kashmir on 1st November, Pakistan did not hand it over to the Azad Jammu and Kashmir government. Pakistan put it under Northwest Frontier Province. So right from the beginning, Pakistan had changed the territorial status quo. As much as 85% of the territory had been absorbed in Pakistan. Now this was a de facto control. Pakistan sought to legitimize it. They concluded in secret what is called Karachi Agreement in 1949, and the agreement was kept secret because this amounted to changing the territorial status quo of POK without a plebiscite. This was signed by three people: Nawab Ghormani, the Minister of Kashmir Affairs in Pakistan government, and on the other hand, there was Sardar Ibrahim, the president of POK, and Ghulam Abbas, who was Muslim Conference president. The agreement came to light only in 1991. In 1991, this is, let me draw a parallel. This was around the time when Pakistan had, sponsored a terror campaign across the line of control, and there was, at the same time, it had strengthened its control on its side of the border. So all the political parties of POK, which included Muslim Conference, Muslim League, all of them banded together and filed a case in POK High Court asking for reversion of northern areas to POK. POK High Court, in a crucial judgment, said that separation of northern areas amounted to violation of the slide 10. The POK High Court in its judgments, next. Yes, the detachment of northern areas from the rest of Azad Jammu and Kashmir tantamounts to violation of the resolutions of the Security Council. Now, this was POK High Court. This was a huge slap on the face of Pakistan government. Pakistan government, of course, tried to get this reversed, and it managed to do so by putting pressure on the POK Supreme Court. Now, this judgment is based on the Karachi Agreement, which till then was kept secret. Now, there are further twists in this drama. Sardar Ibrahim, who was a key signatory, because only he as the POK president had the rights to cede the territory. The other person was Ghulam Abbas, who was the party president. Sardar Ibrahim, in his later life, went around saying, मैंने जिंदगी में और भी गलतियां की हैं, लेकिन ये गलती नहीं की है. I have committed other mistakes also in my life, political mistakes, but I have not done this mistake. So he denied completely ever having signed the Karachi Agreement. Now, Ghulam Abbas, who was Muslim Conference president, he said that his signatures were only related to the party's activities. Karachi Agreement it defines, that the territory will be ceded to Pakistan, and these will be parts of the government. This will be part of the, party's activities, which was essentially propaganda abroad. So Ghulam Abbas also distanced himself because from the secession of territory. Now, the only two Kashmiris who were involved, both of them have essentially said that they were not part of this change. So, and one of them has directly denied ever having signed. So, Pakistan had deceived not only India and the United Nations because it kept the territorial change secret from the UN. It had also deceived the people of POK and Gilgit Baltistan. Now, next. Now, while next. Now, while POK got an interim constitution of sorts in 1974 and it was amended in 2018 by 13th Amendment. Gilgit-Baltistan was always more tightly controlled, and the reason was that this is the most strategic part of the state. This is a part which touches on Wakhan corridor, Afghanistan. It touches China, and this was Wakhan corridor, as you know, the historical background was basically a thin sliver of territory where, you know, to separate Britain's Indian colony from Russia, and therefore they drew in Afghanistan. Now, this is the area where Jammu and Kashmir touches also China, and this is the area where CPEC today enters Pakistan. So, because of this strategic importance, Gilgit-Baltistan has been more tightly controlled, or northern area, which was the original name, more tightly controlled than rest of the POK. It had to wait for an elected council till 2009. In case of POK, the elections had taken place in 1970 and then again in 75. But in case of Gilgit-Baltistan, the elected council was established only by Gilgit-Baltistan order of 2009. Now, mark my words, these are called orders. These are orders of Islamabad. These are not constitutions adopted by the people. Now, Gilgit-Baltistan order, which was adopted under Zardari government, was relatively more lenient towards the people of the territory. The reason being that this is majority of the population of Gilgit-Baltistan are Shia, and Zardari was a Shia, so he was supposed to have, you know, those leanings. So he gave them a relatively more liberal or less strict dispensation. Now, under this, there was a list of 61 subjects on which the Gilgit-Baltistan elected assembly could legislate. Now, 10 years later, almost 9 years later, Gilgit-Baltistan order of 2018 abolished the entire list of 61 subjects on which the earlier order of 2009 had allowed them to legislate. So this led to protests. The copies of the orders were torn in Gilgit-Baltistan Provincial Assembly in the presence of Pakistan's Prime Minister. And the people then went and appealed to the highest judicial court of Gilgit-Baltistan, which set aside the Gilgit-Baltistan order of 2018. Now, this was again a slap on Pakistan's face. Pakistan went in appeal to Pakistan Supreme Court. Pakistan Supreme Court sided with Islamabad and restored the Gilgit-Baltistan order of 2018, against which the people of the territory were protesting. So this shows that they have neither azadi nor, and the wishes of the people are certainly not reflected in the dispensation or the ruling order which Islamabad has imposed on them. Next slide, please. Now, I have, you know, in my book, there are 2 chapters which deal with this issue of plebiscite and self-determination. These are 2 different concepts. Plebiscite is more narrow concept, which was basically an interstate issue. This does not give, you know, the rights to individuals. This is not a human right, and in fact, the right of self-determination had very faint echo in the UN Charter. Right of self-determination was not part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, the same year when this issue went to the United Nations. So, uh, but the right of self-determination expanded. The scope expanded later, and this chapter I have discussed this issue that UK, which was propagating this right, it stated the application of self-determination without any regard to circumstances would be subversive of established government everywhere and could only lead to chaos. Now, this is UK's position in the UN. What was the position under the Independence of India Act? Pakistan was created pursuant to an act of the British Parliament, and this act, under Article 7, mentions accession was the prerogative of the ruler. There is no reference to the people. And not for that matter, Jinnah, Qaid-e-Azam, the man who is credited with having created Pakistan, supported this concept of the right being exercised by the people. He said this is his statement just before the partition, when the partition had already been announced, that the right of accession lies with the ruler. And what was his gamble? Most of the 560 princely states lay in India. There were just about 9 states, princely states in the present day Pakistan. So Jinnah was trying to encourage balkanization of India by stressing the rights of the princely rulers to decide on the issue of accession. He was not willing to give this right to the states in Pakistan. And the two examples, one is Kalat, which is the present day Balochistan, which was which was almost, which was always, semi-detached. Kalat was not even member. They never joined the Chamber of Princes, and they had direct treaty relationship with Baitor. In case of Jammu and Kashmir, both the ruler and the most representative political organization, the National Conference, had opted for India. In case of Kalat, the Khan of Kalat had opted for independence, and this was backed by Loya Jirga, the People's Assembly. And Pakistan's response was to send in the army and arrest the Khan of Kalat, and that was the beginning of the first revolt in Balochistan, which was again crushed by using the army. The other state was Bahawalpur, and which was again within weeks it was taken over by Pakistan. The wishes of the people were not part of the legislative agenda or the bill which was enacted by British Parliament. It was no part of Jinnah's beliefs or stated positions. In fact, there's a very interesting anecdote which Sheikh Abdullah has recited in his memoirs, Flames of Chinar. And Sheikh Abdullah's book is one of the three or four references from the Indian side which are quoted. And Sheikh Abdullah says that, Jinnah went to Kashmir sometime and he made 2 visits. The second visit was in 1948. And one of the political activists, young fellow, asked him about the wishes of the people. And Jinnah's tart reply was, "Let the people go to hell." So wishes of the people had no place in Jinnah's calculus. Next slide, please. Now, this is the economic sovereignty is as important in today's life as political sovereignty. Now, the main resource of POK and Gilgit-Baltistan is water. Mangla Dam, which is located in POK, was completed in 1967. This occupies, major place in Pakistan's history, and most of is one of the major achievements which Ayub Khan has claimed for himself in his memoirs. Now, no payment was made either for water usage or for hydropower generated from Mangla Dam for 36 years. When the first payment began in 2003, 36 years after completion of Mangla Dam, they were paid water usage charges at the rate of 15 paisa per unit, as against 1 rupee 10 paisa, more than 7 times higher for the same molecule of water or the same unit of electricity paid to Punjab and Northwest Frontier Province. And this really shows what the way Pakistan has treated people of POK and Gilgit-Baltistan. Now, what is the justification? The justification, as Pakistan says, under Article 161 of Pakistan's constitution, hydroelectric power royalty can only be paid to Pakistan's provinces, and Pakistan's constitution does not list POK or Gilgit-Baltistan as part of the Pakistan's territory. This is part of the elaborate, subterfuge to maintain the fiction that they are observing the UN resolutions while they have violated it from the beginning. Now, the interesting thing is this Article 161. This is part of the Pakistan's constitution adopted in 1973. This was 6 years after Mangla Dam had been completed. So, if Pakistan was sincere about giving due payment to people of POK, they could have made a provision in Pakistan's constitution when it was adopted in 73. Now, there have been 26 amendments to Pakistani constitution so far. 26 amendments later, still this article has not been touched. So this is not simply a coincidence. And what does this article say? It simply says that the hydropower royalty will be paid to the province in which hydroelectric station is located. Now, this in no way bars payment for electricity or water imported from outside Pakistan's territory, which is, in international trade, this is part of the normal intercourse that you pay for goods and services imported. So even if you accept, Article 161 as it is, it does not really justify. Now, this is a very critical issue. It's critical because the future development of northern areas it hinges upon hydropower. Most of the Chinese investment under CPEC is going to take place in this key area, northern areas. If you look at the map, you'll understand the Chinese motivation. This is basically to catch India in a pincer, that is on one side Eastern Ladakh and on the other side Gilgit-Baltistan. So of the, they announced a figure of $50 billion and it has now come down to some $26 billion. The most of that investment is taking place in Gilgit-Baltistan, and this is in hydropower. Media attention is focused on Gwadar. Gwadar has received only $900 million of Chinese investment. Hydropower in Gilgit-Baltistan will get about $16 billion of Chinese investment. One of the largest dams is going to be Daimar Bhasha Dam. The other one, even still larger, is going to be Bunji Dam. Now, these dams in this ecologically sensitive area can create, problems. There have been earthquakes in the past, and it's going to lead to population displacement. And of course, it will affect the delicate ethnic composition where Shias have a slight majority. I think they are about, over Sunnis. But if, despite all the sacrifice of land and the people, if they still don't get money, and this cannot be done until Article 161 is repealed or amended. So simply giving Gilgit-Baltistan, people of Gilgit-Baltistan, so-called provisional political status, as Imran Khan announced in 2020 during the election campaign in that territory, is not going to make any difference unless Pakistan amends this article, and there's no sign of it. Now, let me very briefly touch on And of course, doing this will be now touch on the election campaign in Gilgit-Baltistan and POK. The Gilgit-Baltistan elections took place in 2020, and POK has just completed elections this year around August. During the election campaign, there was a very in Gilgit-Baltistan there was a Imran Khan had announced that he'll give the provincial political status, which so far has not come through. In case of POK election campaign, there was a very sharp exchange between Maryam Nawaz Sharif, who was leading the PMLN campaign, and Imran Khan. And Maryam Nawaz Sharif said that Imran Khan is trying to rob the people of Azad Kashmir of their distinctive status by making Azad Kashmir a part of Pakistan. This was denied by Imran Khan, and Imran Khan, in his generosity, said there will be two referendums. He used the term referendum. The first one will be to decide whether Azad Kashmir or POK joins Pakistan, and the second then will be to give them the choice of independence option. Now, if you are sincere about independence option, why have this two-stage process? First you opt in, become part of Pakistan, and then opt out. As it is, they have so little freedom when they are in theory not part of Pakistan. Once they become legally part of Pakistan, will they ever be allowed to opt out? So the whole thing is a sham. Now the election results show the kind of democracy is being practiced. It's very interesting that elections in POK invariably result in bringing to power the party which is in power in Islamabad. So predictably enough, PTI won 25 out of 53 seats in the elections in POK. In the last elections in 2016, when Nawaz PMLN was ruling Islamabad, PMLN had won, and PTI then had got just 2 seats. So its tally went from 2 to 25 with the change of government in Islamabad. And similarly, on the other hand, PMLN, which had won 31 seats in 2016 elections, ended up with just 6 seats this year. My last point, and this is Pakistan has appropriated the narrative of Kashmir and Kashmiriyat. Kashmiriyat has no reference in the POK constitution, which defines who's a Muslim. And this provision, in a territory where 98% of population were Muslims, has really no relevance except for creating divisions, which it did by declaring Ahmadiyyas as non-Muslims. And in fact, this provision was inserted in POK constitution before it was included in Pakistan's constitution. Now the irony is that Zafrullah Khan, who argued Pakistan's case in the Security Council, was an Ahmadiyya. If he were alive today, he would be declared a non-Muslim both in Pakistan and in POK. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for an elaborate and comprehensive review of the developments in Pakistan, POK, Gilgit-Baltistan, with particular reference to policies and practices in actual practices in the region. I believe this book, I think it is well researched based on primary sources, particularly from Pakistan and POK, and which lends authenticity to the study. I think Indian policymakers, practitioners, academia, media, and public opinion need to draw appropriate lessons from the well calculated and sustained Pakistan's policy and practices in POK and Gilgit-Baltistan in terms of its control over this strategic territory, manipulation of local politics and government according to Islamabad's designs, and using the region for having and forging long-term strategic alliance with China and turning the region into a launchpad for terrorism in Indian Kashmir and so on. In India, we have been listening about the rhetoric of claiming or Indian claims over POK and GB being the and trying to, political parties have also been indulging in the rhetoric of let us reclaim our territory. I recall that it was only in February 1994 when under Narasimha Rao government, the Indian Parliament passed a unanimous resolution laying down the basis for this entire state of Jammu and Kashmir being the integral part of India, and this was a reaction to the Pakistani push and pressure on pushing the resolution against India in the Human Rights Council. And recently, 2 years back, on 5th August 2019, Indian Parliament passed the J&K Reorganization Bill 2019, creating two separate union territories of Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir. That the POK, Pak occupied territory of Gilgit-Baltistan, has been included in theory and in maps in the Union Territory of Ladakh is a recognition of the historical reality, and I think a course correction in Indian policy. But India needs to follow up by taking concrete and tangible steps by consolidating and strengthening its firm presence in the valley of Kashmir, in the society, politics, and governance in Ladakh as well as in Jammu and Kashmir, Indian part of Jammu and Kashmir. Abolition of Article 370 and 35A in J&K have been taken. They are the initial steps, theoretical in theory, but they need to be implemented. And how it can be done, how they legitimate political aspirations of the deprived sections and neglected sections of society, particularly the refugees from POK and West Pakistan who have had no right to vote for the last 70 years in J&K. I think, and I suggest to this august audience, pursue this and ponder over this issue. I think the newly constituted Delimitation Commission can do it easily by reserving or allocating 4 to 5 seats in the J&K Assembly for about 500,000 such POK refugees. Similarly, about 500,000 Kashmiri Pandit displaced persons who were forced out of the valley in 1989 90 need to be provided about 4 to 5 assembly seats. Pakistan, we should learn from Pakistan. Pakistan has reserved 6 seats for Kashmiri refugees, just 30,000 refugees who went from the valley to POK in 1947-48. They have reserved 6 refugee seats, and they call it Kashmiri refugee seats. And they have reserved another 6 refugee seats for 434,000 people who were registered as refugees coming from Jammu province to POK in 47-48. And ever since 47-48, Pakistan has been manipulating federal government. Some others manipulating these 12 refugee seats to tilt the balance of power in Islamabad's favor in POK region. And they have been doing it comfortably. And mind you, none of these refugees live in POK. They are scattered throughout Pakistan, wide across Pakistan. They are used as a trump card by federal government to influence the formation of government in POK during and after every election there. So Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir or UT of J&K has 24 reserved seats for POK and GB. But it is only in theory. In practice, we need to draw, I think, appropriate lessons from Pakistani policy and practice. And time has come for India to take a strategic decision to call the bluff of the valley-based political blackmail and create a fresh political narrative by giving political space to legitimate pan-Indian and nationalist forces in the UT of Jammu and Kashmir. With these words, I throw this forum discussion for open for you. Please.
So, Marco, I'll start by your statement. When you say that there's a lot to learn from Pakistan,
From their experience in POK.
whatever it is.
No, whatever.
No.
I am specific in
On
terms of
POK.
refugees, not.
No, on POK.
I am not ambiguous.
I think the only thing to learn from Pakistan on POK is not to believe a word of Pakistan. Not to believe a word of Pakistan.
How does it
You see,
matter to them?
I'll tell you, sir. Because you see, a lot of things you see, the day Indian policy makers decide on this, how long we can be cheated by Pakistan, how long we can go on believing Pakistan's
You missed
words.
my point entirely. That is not the issue. Whether we have to emulate Pakistan or whether we have. I am referring to refugee seats. It was.
Sir, that seats also, you see, you yourself are contradicting yourself, sir, with due respect, when you say that they manipulate those seats to manipulate their power in Kashmir.
But they also give the refugees, Kashmiri refugees who went to Pakistan are settled in various parts of Pakistan.
Sir, the very thing I feel is, who is a Kashmiri refugee in Pakistan? You have a Pak-occupied Kashmir. You have a Pak-occupied homeland for those Kashmiris. So how come they have become refugees in Pakistan? I'm unable to understand this.
They are registered as refugees since 1940.
No, I may register Rohingyas as refugees. They may be intruders. The question is not that. I'm coming to ground brass track realities, sir. That the fault lies with us is that we in India refused. Bhutto came and said, "Madam, I am in your hands." We leave the 95,000 to go away over there. Ayub says something in Tashkent, we leave it go over there. Now also the recent example, you have seen that Pakistan, this recent ceasefire with Pakistan, 4 months back or 6 months back, 4 months back, 3 months back. What did Pakistan do? They do a ceasefire with us. They are happy from their eastern borders, and they go and intervene in Afghanistan and do everything over there. And now we are here sitting and thinking.
So what is your last point? Is there any other point you want to say? Any other thing?
Yes, sir. I have to.
Yeah, please.
Sir, we'll listen to you. Fine. Sorry.
No,
I don't have to ask anything. Sorry. We'll listen to you more because we have.
No, I am not to say. I am just inviting comments from the audience.
Fine.
You had your point. Yes.
Dinka, thank you very much for the very nice talk you have given to us, and a lot of insights I heard for the first time. In fact, you brought out very nicely that the double standards Pakistan has. One thing they do actually, and they, on the other hand, if India does something similar, vaguely similar also, there's a lot of criticism. I think a lot of inputs which you have exposed should be used by India in UN debates, in countering the, what Pakistan says internationally, and also exposed to the people of Jammu and Kashmir on the Indian side what's happening, and what's happening in POK. I think that we have not been able to expose to the civil society in India or internationally or in Pakistan. And your book should be helpful in that. The other thing I want to ask you a question. Dixon in 1953, as you said, that was the time when India offered plebiscite. What was the reason in 1953 that it was not taken up? And there was also a Dixon plan.
Not taken up by whom?
That's what I said, by Pakistan. You said. No? So maybe you'd like to give a little more detail about that. And there was a Dixon plan of dividing Jammu and Kashmir at that time. That means Jammu division would be this thing and Kashmir would be with Pakistan. Can you throw some light on that?
Sure.
I think Joseph wants to.
Firstly, compliments, Venkat Srivastava. We read a lot globally and, of course, in India about what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir, but we hardly get to know about what's happening on the other side. At least I don't. And I think many don't. So I think your book is, for me, the first eye-opener to the other side of the line of control. So compliments. Couple of questions. One is, on the one hand, as you said, Pakistan, or it's called Azad Kashmir. Pakistan occupied Kashmir is called Azad Kashmir, and on the other, it is also a part of the, or it is written into the constitution of Pakistan and vice versa. So, what is the position of Pakistan today? Do they still cling on to the false notion that it is Azad Kashmir, or they have given up the ambivalence? And is it Pakistan's claim today that it's fully a part of the Pakistani territory, state of Pakistan? Yeah, and exactly. And then the next question is the future. Where do you think this thing continuing for the next 30, 40 years? Where do you see the situation 30 or 40 years from now? Jammu and Kashmir, Azad Kashmir, and so on, especially in the context of talk of Akhand Bharat, and if that implies a return of territories back to India. But even setting that aside, where do you see the two countries, Azad Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir, being 30 or 40 years from now? And finally, how is the derogation of Article 370 impacted has it impacted on Azad Kashmir or POK, positively or negatively?
Sir, one correction that will help the discussion.
Please.
This Dixon plan is not made by Dixon. This is a plan given by V.P. Menon before December 48. A plan sent to Mountbatten, copy of it sent to the British High Commissioner in India, where he says, give Dogra occupied Jammu to India, the ferry to Pakistan, and have a plebiscite in Ladakh. You propose this plan, Mountbatten should see that must before the Jinnah and Nehru meeting takes place. Sir, if you are not listening,
We are listening. You are used to.
What he writes to Mountbatten, then writes here that it should be ensured that Mountbatten passes this on to the British Prime Minister before the Liaquat Ali and Jinnah meeting. So this is V.P. Menon, and he says, I will get my ministers agree to this plan. I'm sure, sir, you must have seen the 2 volumes published by Leonard Carter on the military intelligence reports relating to Kashmir between 46 and 48. They were published 5 years back, sir. And 2 volumes on India on the partition of India by Leonard Carter. And Leonard Carter was the librarian who did the transfer of power volumes. And these are all military intelligence documents. And in these documents, I found that Sheikh Abdullah, when he comes to Jalandhar, he says Nehru's Kashmir, and simultaneously he is in correspondence with both those Azad Kashmir leaders over there and with Jinnah. Let us not forget that Liaquat Ali was sitting in Atoka Bahar on 24th October. Let us not forget that the aim of theirs was not only up to Srinagar, but their plan was to come to Patiala and take over Lahore also. And then let us also start this narrative from this account that when UN is there, why a country, the Kawaii were not a country. Under what circumstances the matter was taken to UN by Nehru. And the last thing is, if we are talking about a UN, does anyone bother for any UN resolutions today? A platform in which Pakistan can put false photographs and nothing happens to that. If UN today passes a resolution that plebiscite should be held or India should give POK to Pakistan or give this, will we agree? It's a defunct body today which is not prepared to take decision whether it is COVID or whether it is anything. So why we put up these theoretical aspects only, this, that, a theoretical intellectual exercises, whereas the ground realities and practical aspects are totally different.
Why don't you?
Sir, I have a question.
पहले ये 2-3 इकट्ठे कर लेंगे पहले इनको ये 3 issues.
I have a question.
Yeah, after these 3 finish.
Let me, Pankaj had raised this issue of, Dixon Plan. And Dixon Plan, I had explained, the plebiscite was to be limited to Valley, and regional plebiscite was essentially to avoid the kind of forced migration which was taking place, because plebiscite across the entire state would have left pockets of minorities on either side. Now, you asked why Pakistan did not accept plebiscite. In answer, that is, there was this military operation going on in POK from 1950 till late 50s for almost 7-8 years. So how could Pakistan accept plebiscite when it was not sure of winning the vote even in the territory illegally occupied by it? Even in 53, even after Abdullah's departure. Now this ambivalence in Pakistan's position. Now this is something which has continued. 1993, this is 40 years later, Benazir Bhutto, as Pakistan's Prime Minister, in an interview to New York Times, dismissed this idea of, plebiscite or referendum, and if it included independence option, because she said that in such a case, Hindus and Sikhs will vote for India, Muslim vote will be split, and her words was that there will be no change in territorial status quo. Now, this is very interesting because any vote which India lost would result in a change in territorial status quo, the territory going to the other side. So obviously, what she was admitting, she didn't want to say it in so many words, was that she was not sure that Pakistan will win the vote. Now, I have to clarify, there are two aspects which got left out from my presentation. With Chair's permission, these are very critical issues, and I have got the slide here. Shimla Agreement, this issue keeps coming back, relevance of the UN resolutions. And our stand, which is that UN resolutions anyway had asked Pakistan to withdraw, which they did not do. So POK is an illegal creation. Now, interestingly, why are you fiddling? Interestingly, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, as President of Pakistan, in a debate on Shimla Agreement in Pakistan National Assembly on 14 July 1972, admitted that UN resolutions did not support Pakistan's position on Kashmir, and he was referring to the UN resolutions of 48. And he said that was the day, that was the moment when you jeopardize the right of self-determination in Jammu and Kashmir. Let me give you the background. The background is given in the book. I don't have the time. Basically, what he was saying was that UN resolutions had asked Pakistan to withdraw completely from the territories, withdraw all its forces from the territory occupied by it. While in case of India, it only asked for withdrawal of some troops. So essentially, this was a loss of land which he could not countenance, and he said that the UN resolutions did not support them. Now, this was not a one-off statement. He repeated it 14 days later in Karachi. This is critical because after Shimla Agreement, which had committed the two countries to resolve all issues bilaterally, Pakistan has resurrected these UN resolutions, claiming that they are still on the books. But even if they are on the books, according to Pakistan's president himself, they do not support Pakistan's position. The second thing, and I'm talking of the current situation because we cannot live in the past forever. This is, Pakistan has undergone a very major change sometime around 2010. This is during Zardari period, when 18th Amendment of Pakistan's constitution was adopted. Its significance was that it devolved more powers and resources to Pakistan's provinces. Now, you contrast this with the situation in POK and Gilgit-Baltistan. I mentioned 13th Amendment of POK Constitution, which was in 2018, and Gilgit-Baltistan order of the same year. Now, both these developments took place 8 years after Pakistani provinces had been given more powers and resources. In case of POK and Gilgit-Baltistan, the trend was in the reverse direction. Pakistan tightened its control. So people of POK and Gilgit-Baltistan are not treated on the same level as people of Pakistan. And this is, something which, what was the reason? The reason was sometime around 2013, CPEC was announced. Now that Pakistan, realizing the strategic importance of this territory, Pakistan military has strengthened control. Now, coming back to Joseph's point, that is, what is Pakistan's official position on POK, or whether it has actually, it regards it as part of Pakistan. Pakistan still maintains the same dichotomy. In theory, Azad Kashmir, quote unquote, is Azad. So it is distinct from Pakistan. Pakistan's constitution still does not include POK and Gilgit-Baltistan as part of Pakistan's territories. In practice, and this is the dichotomy, they were integrated in Pakistan from the beginning. My book quotes an internal memorandum issued by Ghulam Ishaq Khan as cabinet secretary in 1970, and 1970, yes, and this was repeated in 1988 by his whatever successor was in position. And the memorandum to Pakistani government department said that POK should be treated on the same basis as other provinces of Pakistan. So POK in effect has already been integrated, and Gilgit-Baltistan was always under Pakistani control. What about future? I think the future lies in recognizing that India made the right choice, and that choice was that religion cannot be the basis of statehood. And I think this is the principle which has to be upheld. Looking forward, 30 years later, I'm sure India will not only be there, will be stronger. I'm not sure what Pakistan will be, in what shape. And certainly, POK, I don't think whatever internal fissures that you see in Pakistan from Gilgit, but Balochistan, maybe you can say it's an outlier province, but Karachi, both the Sindhis and the Muhajirs, Northwest Frontier Province. So I don't think that we can discuss what Pakistan will look like in 40 years' time.
Owen Dixon.
I frankly don't think we can attach so much of importance to what the British intelligence was saying. We have to go by what the Pakistani and the Indian statesmen were saying and doing, because you're playing the same, you're making the same mistake of crediting an omnipotence to British intelligence 70 years after they have left the territory. Mountbatten, and this is recorded by Ellen Campbell Johnson, who certainly was closer to Mountbatten than this gentleman, that librarian that you referred to. Ellen Campbell Johnson has recorded that Mountbatten, when he went to Kashmir, he told the Maharaja that he had it on Patel's authority. Patel was a strong man of Congress, that India will not mind whatever decision the Maharaja takes. So India did not force the issue. It was Pakistan which forced the issue through tribal invasion, and the rest was
Sir, the difference of approach between a historian and a diplomat is that a historian bases on the basis of documents, not on the basis of secondary sources. The same Mountbatten, when he went for a day to Srinagar, told the Maharaja, "Okay, you don't join any of the unions." And when from there it came that the accession document came, who put it there that it is temporary, subject to plebiscite? It is Mountbatten. It is Mountbatten. So we can't ignore that when you say that, sir. And when you say that British intelligence,
that is what I'm saying.
not quoting that from British intelligence. I am quoting a letter written by VP Menon. Do you know, sir, that VP Menon, in a letter to the British, had leaked out the Hyderabad polo operation to them? And he says in that letter, कि I can't tell you the date because that is not in my purview. I had tremendous respect for this man. But after seeing what this man is doing, playing the ICCS card same with the British, you can't ignore the British Army's role during 46-47, what they are doing on both sides.
Kapil, I think you will give time to me. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm seeking time from you, Kapil, because you are a friend, so I can say that give me time. I know it's already 4:35 and I have been regular in this room and I know that latest by 4:10 we finish the lectures.
440.
But anyway, we are late. There are two things. First is I would like to congratulate Ambassador Srivastava. I have some abiding interest in Jammu and Kashmir, and my reference points have always been Sardar Patel's correspondence. And you know, Volume 1 deals exclusively with Jammu and Kashmir, running around 700 pages. Then Jawaharlal Nehru's correspondence and also transfer to power and all that. This is the first time, sir. Thank you very much. We are hearing not only from Pakistan sources, but sources which are not available in Hindi or English. And I know that your knowledge of Persian and Urdu has helped to shape this, what you have done. And we as a historian community assure you that we shall be very grateful because a lot of material has come on the history side, which has been unknown to us. So my heartful thanks and congratulations for this wonderful thing. A very small point, Kapil, which will cover you also. If you look at the correspondence between Maharaja, Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru, things were messed up by Jawaharlal Nehru. And because the animosity between Jawaharlal Nehru and Maharaja came such that whole accession of document became an issue when it was signed. And if you read the volume 1 of Sardar Patel, Maharaja was not hesitating, but he was always doubting Nehru's vision because Nehru was so overtly with Abdullah. So therefore, there are a lot of ifs and buts, but at the moment, because the issue was completely different side, and sir, thank you very much for this wonderful exposition. We are grateful.
After him.
Sir, as per print media reports, the quantum of fossil fuel below the crust of the earth in the Muslim regions in the Gulf region of Asia is going to get exhausted around 2071. And as of now, Saudi Arabia is a major influencer in Pakistan policies by virtue of its contribution of funds. So when that happens, the quantum of fossil fuel getting exhausted below the crust of the earth in the Muslim countries in the Gulf region, then in what manner will it influence Kashmir politics?
May I thank Professor Makhanlal, but let me just clarify. I owe a great deal to the UN Library in New York and also to the Library of Congress in Washington, because the debates in Pakistan Assembly, which I believe for the first time, my book has brought out, these are, I would not have been given access to in Pakistan. Now, answering your question, sir, I think Glasgow summit is just over, and there is this goal of net zero emission, which various countries have adopted by 2050, 2060. India has accepted it for 2070. So whether or not there is fossil fuel under the ground, it is very difficult to use that fossil fuel. You have to reduce the carbon footprints, and that requires a huge energy transition which will require vast resources. This is an entirely different area, but I'll be very happy to talk to you. I'm coordinating a task force on India's energy transition in a carbon-constrained world, but that's a completely different issue.
Okay, please, last question.
Sir, I will take just a futuristic viewpoint. The way recently Dr. Jitendra Singh has pointed out that very soon we will retrieve our POK. Do you think it will happen in forthcoming election 24, or we are really prepared for this type of situation, or is just a illusion?
पहले अपना नट एंड बोल्ट ठीक करो, वो ढीला है बहुत.
the way Pakistan is going towards disintegration, it will come on its own.
In Saudi Arabia, and Hmm.
There was a ceasefire in Jammu and Kashmir declared, I think it's on 1st January 1949. Who declared the ceasefire? Indian General, Sheikh Abdullah, Jawaharlal Nehru, or somebody else? Ceasefire declaration in Jammu and Kashmir.
These are, historical aspects. There's a lot of documentation available in public domain. There was this Karachi Agreement of 49 on ceasefire. There is, of course, the issue. I have covered this in my book. Sardar Ibrahim, in his memoirs, has admitted that by December 48, so-called Azad forces and Pakistan army was retreating across a wide front. So there is a question why India did not complete the mission. That would have been the end of the problem. And I think if you want to study more, you have to read Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta's book on Kashmir, which is based on British sources. Mine is based on Pakistani sources. So that is a difference. But what my book tries to bring out is that the history did not stop in 47 or 48. So you have to keep in mind the subsequent developments. And this is a huge difference between India's story and the Pakistani story, where they have kept going on to narrower and narrower identities. And as I mentioned, religion cannot be basis of statehood.
Thank you, Ambassador Srivastava. We had a very lively discussion, and I must congratulate you for this extensive and comprehensive analysis of the developments in POK, and particularly based on fact sources.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience, for your active participation. All of you are invited to tea, to have tea.